Well, good morning. Good morning. I want to say first thanks to Terry for allowing me to speak and kick off this Easter season with you. And thank you guys for the amount of time that you've allowed me to share this pulpit and to be up here and just to learn and to be able to speak more and more as I've been at Bayside. I appreciate so much what you guys have done for me in that and letting me teach a little bit more. And thank you to Terry, the elders, for allowing me to do that as well. As Terry said, we're kicking off the Easter season. And this is really, honestly, if you've never been at Bayside for the Easter season, you've missed out, because it's my favorite time of year at Bayside. It's when things are all clicking on all cylinders. There's so much activity, so much fun stuff. And as Terry said, there's the Easter service that it all culminates with on March 27th, right? And then it moves back to Good Friday on March 25th, and you'll want to be here for that service where we remember the death of Jesus before we celebrate the resurrection. And then you go back even further to this next Saturday where we have Extravaganza, one of my favorite events that Bayside pulls off. Has anybody been to Extravaganza? Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? It's one of my favorite things. It's one of the chances where we can invite our community to come to this campus, to be here with no strings attached, just saying, hey, bring your family, bring your friends, and come pet some animals and find some Easter eggs and eat some hot dogs on us. And no strings attached, but hey, if you are looking for a church, we'd love to have you. And so if you haven't signed up to help with that, I know Jeannie just needs a handful more of volunteers, just a handful, and you're probably the person she's looking for. So if you haven't signed up yet, please sign up. Let her know that you're willing and able to volunteer for that day, because it's an awesome event. And speaking of eggs and Extravaganza, you may be wondering why I'm holding a chicken. I know it's normal. I know that usually pastors come out holding live animals on stage, so this is pretty common day, really. But this little gal, her name's Claire, and she's Mac and Amy's new addition to their family. And Claire is just a little chick. And when I was in high school, I went to a very strict private high school. And it was an outdoor campus. It was a K through 12 private school. We had very strict uniforms. It was a very high academic school. It was a very difficult school to get into. And there came a day where it was my senior year, and I was walking through the courtyard right in the middle of our campus. As I walked through the courtyard, I noticed this little pen that they had set up, this little square that they'd set up right in the middle of the courtyard, and it had chicken wire all around it. You know, like that mesh chicken wire stuff? It had that all around it, but nothing was inside the pen. And I was like, I wonder what they're doing there. And now that I think about it, they were probably planting a garden or something. But at the time, I had no idea what they were doing. So a couple days later, I'm with a friend, and we're at the South Florida Fairgrounds. And we're at the fair, a great place to hang out. And we're at this fairgrounds. And I'm walking by a booth in the 4-H section of the world. And it turns out you can buy live chickens at the fair. And I saw this booth where you could buy live chickens. And they weren't even expensive. And so I went over to the booth, and I was like, hey, do you have any more chickens? And they were like, yeah, why? And I was like, because my school put up chicken wire. I figure it needs chickens. And they were like, okay. And so I bought 2 chickens. Now, they took them from separate cages. They only had 2 left, and they put them in a bucket and gave them to me. And I paid them for them, and they gave me this bucket. And as I walked out, I took the bucket, and I realized, I kid you not, they put them in a KFC bucket. It's just a rough start to life. And it's all going to come full circle. And so I took these 2 chickens in the KFC bucket. I gave them some food and put some stuff in the bucket, and they lived there overnight. And the next day I was at school, and I stayed late for a practice, and really nobody else was on campus. And so I was walking by this section with the chicken wire, and I took these 2 little chickens, these little chicks like this, and I dropped them right in the chicken wire. And they stayed in this little pen, and I gave them some food, and I left. And I came back the next day to school, as did everybody else, and nobody knew where these chickens came from. And our grounds crew was real concerned, like, hey, where'd these chickens come from? And nobody knew, and so they were trying to figure out, is this like a biology experiment? Is there a biology class doing work on this? Is this like a 5th grade class experiment? Are they doing a class project with a chicken? And nobody claimed it, and nobody knew, and I didn't say a word. And so those chickens just grew up. They just stayed there. They were there for about a year. And as they grew up, it turns out one of them was in fact a hen, and the other was a rooster. And as the rooster grew older, it learned to crow. And the crowing got it in trouble with the neighbors. And so what I heard later was that they got taken to a farm. They may be back in a KFC bucket today. But today I want to look at a rooster story in the Bible where a rooster symbolizes a turning point, a huge momentous turning point in the relationship between two guys in the Bible who are big characters. It's a really important moment, and it's all symbolized by a rooster, and it's crowing. So at this point, I'm going to give this guy back to Mac. Here, Claire is going to go back to Mac here. Can you thank Mac and Amy for bringing this guy? Yeah. Here you go. Thanks. So we're going to pick up this story, and you probably know this story. This story is the denial, right? It's the denial of Peter, of Christ, when the rooster crows. And you probably know that part of the story. I hear it's good to sanitize afterwards. You probably know that part of the story. You probably know the story where this rooster crows and suddenly we realize that Peter's denied Jesus. But let me say that's just a snapshot of the bigger picture of the story. That's like taking a still frame out of a movie. It's just one little piece of this much grander picture of Jesus and Peter and their lives. They have a much bigger relationship. It goes all the way through the Gospels. It's a huge relationship, about 3 years worth. And today we're going to weave in and out of all kinds of Gospels to make this whole story kind of complete. It's going to be a big picture, a big overview of their story together. So for the next 3.5 hours, just sit back as that wasn't a joke. And so just sit back as we make this happen, okay? Peter and Jesus, they're kind of an unlikely pairing, really. So Peter, he's this guy who's a fisherman. He's a blue collar guy. He works in this industry just like his dad did as a fisherman. And it's a messy industry. It's a gutsy industry. It's yucky. It's very blue collar. It's very vulgar. It's a hard job to have. He works in what would be today's dirty jobs, right? He works in this fish industry. And then you got Jesus, who's this rabbi, right? And Jesus is this guy who is esteemed in the community. He's well respected by the people. He's a rabbi. He has a lot of respect with the people. So you have this unlikely pairing right off the bat between these two. And they meet in Luke chapter 5. It says this about them, and we're going to kind of, again, weave through some Gospels here. But it says, one day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. Jesus, he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked to pull it out a little bit more, which we don't know if Jesus just hijacked this boat or what. He may have just stolen this boat. It doesn't tell us that he knew who owned the boat. It just says that he hops in a boat and he's like, hey, could you push this out for me? I'm going to take this boat with me somewhere. So he hops in the boat and he says, Simon, could you push me out a little bit from this shore? So Simon does. It says, then he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. So these crowds are coming in around Jesus. They're all closing in so much on the shoreline that Jesus says, I need to get away from this huge crowd. They can't hear me. They're crowding in too much. So he says, I'm going to sit in a boat and push this boat backwards. And now from this water, I'm going to teach from the boat and see everybody up on the shore. So he looks up and he starts teaching. He says, then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let's let down our nets for a catch. Now, Jesus is not a fisherman. He knows nothing about fishing. He was a carpenter's son. He's a rabbi. And you got to think that Peter's like, yeah, I've kind of been at this for like 30 years, bro. Like, I kind of know my way around this. So maybe back up a little bit. But Simon, or Peter, being who he would be, he says this, Master, we've worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. Because you say so. And maybe this moment right here is when Jesus sees this willing spirit in Peter. And he's like, yeah, you're my guy. Maybe this is the moment where it's just this weird test, this weird moment where he sees Peter go, yeah, I think I know about fishing, Jesus, but because you say so, I'm going to do what you're saying. I'm going to drop the nets down. And Jesus sees this in Peter. It says, when they had done so, when they had dropped the nets down, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. So Jesus tells them what to do. He says, hey, drop this net in. And as soon as they do, they get so many fish. And I know Bob, I know Scott, I know you guys would be thrilled about this situation. Always fish with Jesus. Okay, that's the lesson today. You know, they drop these nets in and suddenly they can't even get them all on the boat. They have to get a second boat. Jesus just told them where to drop the nets and suddenly their boats are full of fish. And right after this, it says this in Matthew. It says, then Jesus says, come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. And at once they left their nets and followed him. Jesus says these two words that changed Peter's life. He says, follow me. And what does Peter do? He drops his nets. Now, these are nets full of fish. This is his livelihood. This is his money. This is his pride and joy. And he drops the nets that are full of fish and he walks off with Jesus. And now his life's a whole different direction. Now he becomes Jesus' like right-hand man. They become inseparable. Like Peter becomes the Barney Rubble to Jesus being Fred Flintstone. Like Peter becomes like the Spock to Jesus being Captain Kirk. Or Jesus becomes the Dwight Schrute to Jesus being Michael Scott. Or, you know, something like that. Like Jesus and Peter become an inseparable pair. It's like Jesus is Paul Simon and suddenly Peter is Art Garfunkel, you know? It's just this beautiful pairing, and the two of them do everything together. They are best friends. They do so much ministry together. And we see this with them. The next 3 years, they have so many adventures and misadventures that they go on, and Peter gets a front row seat to see everything that Jesus is doing, right? He sees Jesus calm the storm with his hands and calm the waves, but then he sees Jesus walk on those same waves, right? He sees Jesus up on a mountain and get transfigured, but he also sees Jesus on a mountain preaching the Sermon on the Mount. Peter sees Jesus heal hundreds of people and feed thousands at a time. Peter's there for all of it for the next 3 years. He's his right-hand man. He's probably his closest friend in all of ministry. And that's the way the next 3 years would go. And if this was like a movie, this would be the musical montage where it's like best friends doing best friend things and like they're, you know, riding scooters together. Like they do everything together that best friends would do short of like getting matching tattoos. Like they do everything as best friends would, right? That's their life together. They do so much life together. But 3 years later, we see them end up at a dinner table. And you and I know it as the Last Supper. Now, Peter didn't understand this was the Last Supper Jesus would eat before he was crucified. But we know it as the Last Supper. They end up at a Passover feast, and Jesus and all of his disciples are at the Passover feast, right? They're in the upper room. And they're all sitting there. And we all see the Passover feast sometimes as this really stoic event that's really serious. And you know, all the guys had to sit on one side of the table, right? Because that's how you paint it. And everybody was like really serious. It was a very stoic event, right? Now, I don't know that the Passover was really that stoic. Now, yes, it was a great time of remembrance, but it was also a festival. It was a celebration. The whole town was celebrating Passover. It was a celebration. And so some of these guys may have been kind of lighthearted going into this dinner. They may have been enjoying this almost, thinking, man, this is Passover. This is awesome. We look forward to this every year. But then they sit down to the table and they start to see that things are getting serious. That Jesus isn't quite so lighthearted. Jesus maybe is acting a little bit different. Jesus knows what's about to happen. He knows he's about to be captured. He's about to be tried. He's about to be crucified. So he knows what's coming. But the disciples don't seem to grasp that. And so they sit at the table, and what happens? Jesus hands out this first communion, right? Where he takes this bread, and he breaks this bread, and he gives it to them. And he says, this is my body, which is broken for you. He hands that around. He takes the cup. This is my blood, which will be poured out for you. And they sit at this table, and after they finish this dinner, Jesus makes this really interesting prediction. And he starts talking about how he will be betrayed. And he actually says this in front of all the disciples. And it says this, Jesus predicts Peter's denial. He says, you will all of you disciples, you will all fall away, Jesus told them. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. He's quoting scripture here to say this is a prophecy. It's going to happen, guys. It's almost like Jesus is giving them an out. Like, hey guys, it's gonna happen, just deal with it. You're gonna all run away from me. You're all gonna betray me. You're all gonna leave me alone. That's what's gonna happen. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And Peter, being Peter always does this. He can't stand to sit still very long. He can't keep his mouth shut for very long. And he just has to say something. He's like, no. Even if all fall away, I will not. He makes this bold proclamation that no. Everybody else could fall away, but not this guy. I'm sticking with you, Jesus. And Jesus answers, truly, I tell you today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. And Peter insists emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And it says this interesting line, and all the others said the same. Now, Peter gets this bad rap, right? We all see Peter as the bad guy who's like, he says something, but he can't back it up. But the truth is, all the disciples said the same thing too. You kind of got to feel bad for Peter sometimes, right? Like Peter, like when he's walking on the water and we're all like, oh man, that guy didn't have enough faith to walk on the water. Well, nobody else got out of the boat. You know, the poor guy, he's trying so hard. All the disciples said the same thing. They all promised this allegiance to Jesus. They all said there's no way we would ever deny you. And they all fell away. Now for you and I know that it's sometimes the same way. When we enter a relationship with Jesus, right, we think, man, nothing could ever go wrong. When you first start out on this journey with Jesus, what do you think? You're like, I would never deny this person who's giving me my life back. I would never falter in this relationship. I would never have doubts about Jesus. But then you know how it goes. Things get hard. Maybe it's when you found out about that affair. And suddenly you go, I don't know about this anymore. Maybe it's when you got this health diagnosis and the test came back, whether positive or negative, and you went, uh-oh, I don't know if I really believe this anymore. Where are you at, Jesus? Maybe it's when the business folded and suddenly you didn't have the job or the income that you used to have. Suddenly you're like, I don't know about this. And you start to have these doubts. You start to deny just a little bit. And if you're honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, I've been there. When I was 7 years old, I was at a Good Friday service. And just like what we do here, this was 25 years ago. I am a million, apparently. I'm really old. 25 years ago, I was sitting at a Good Friday service. And in the Church of God, which is what Bayside is, we still celebrate a thing called foot washing, and it's when Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And we'll do that at our Good Friday service on March 25th. And I was sitting in this room when I was 7 years old with all these men with their shoes off, and it smelled terrible. And my dad was one of the pastors at this church, and it was a very large church. And I'm looking around the room, and I'm the only 7-year-old, because when you're the son of a pastor, you have to go to everything at the church. So I'm sitting there, I'm the only kid in the room. And my dad's across the room. And I see my dad stand up. He walks to the middle of the room where the water is and where the basin is. And he fills up the basin with water. And I'm sitting there watching the whole room thinking, who's he going to go to? He knows every guy in this room. Who's he going to go to? And I remember the moment that he beelined it straight to me. My dad knelt down at my feet. And he took my feet and he washed them. And he looked up at me and said, Kevin, I love you. It was at that moment that I asked him, I said, would you pray with me because I want to accept Jesus into my life? And he prayed with me and I accepted Jesus. And I thought, I would never, ever deny Jesus who loves us this much to give me a father who would wash my feet and a man who would wash his own disciples' feet. I didn't know that literally 2 years, almost to the day later, that my dad would be taken from me, that he would die. That same dad who would wash my feet passed away almost 2 years to the date later. I'm not going to lie. As a pastor, Maybe I'm not allowed to admit this, but my goodness, for the next couple years, did I deny Christ at every turn that I could. I didn't know where he was anymore. I didn't think I believed in him anymore. What kind of God does that? And we all do that. We all deny if we're honest with ourselves. Peter's not the only one. We do it, and all the other disciples said they wouldn't either, just like we say. Fortunately, that's not where the story ends. After this happens, after they're in this room, they go to the garden. And Jesus takes the disciples to a garden, and he takes them to pray, and he says, guys, I'm about to have some really bad things happen to me. Would you pray for me? And the disciples keep falling asleep. It was probably the day after a time change or something. So they kept falling asleep, and they were praying and praying and praying. And so as they're praying, Jesus, he's praying so hard that he has sweat that's turning into blood coming out of him. He's so fervently praying, saying, if this cup can pass from me, let it pass. But he knows what's about to happen. And he's just told Peter that you're going to deny me. Peter's got to be praying and feeling really weird about this situation, right? But they're in the garden, and just as Jesus predicted, the Roman guard comes after him, and it says this: while he was still speaking, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them, which John, the Gospel of John, names this disciple as Peter. He says, Peter struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. And you got to think in Peter's mind, he's like, see, I just passed the test. I didn't deny you. I did it. I hacked off that dude's ear. He's got to be thinking, I did it. I passed the test. But Jesus isn't satisfied with that. That's not what Jesus was talking about. And he says this, but Jesus answered, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed him, which is one of Jesus' weirdest miracles. Like, you got to think if you're this servant guy and you're like, yeah, he cut my ear off, but then Jesus just put it back on. I don't know. It's kind of weird. I think I can still hear pretty good. It's a weird moment, right? And so Jesus restores this man's ear, and Jesus goes with them. So Peter's got to be thinking he passed the test, but he hasn't yet. And then it says this, going on, it says, then seizing him, they led him and they took him into the house of the high priest. Now Peter followed at a distance. Now we got to give Peter credit here because Peter does follow him. The rest of the disciples, they've actually given up. They've all gone home. Peter's the only one who consistently follows him through the story. So Peter follows at a distance, and when he was there, some there had kindled a fire in the middle of a courtyard and sat down together. And Peter sat down with them. So Peter crouches down at this fire, and there's these flames. As he sits there, he's smelling the smoke. He's probably trying not to be seen, probably trying to hide his face a little bit. He sits down at the fire with them. It says a servant girl was seated there next to him, just a servant girl. And he saw her in the firelight, and she noticed his face. And she looked at him closely. And she goes, this guy, he was with them. But Peter says, no. He denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. Probably thought he was done. She noticed he was with him. But then it goes on. It's not the end of the story. Another person comes up. The second person says, a little bit later, someone else saw him and said, hey, you're one of them. Man, I am not, Peter says. Notice this time there's an exclamation point. Peter's getting a little more heated. Then a third time, about an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean. Peter replies, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And just as he said that, the rooster crowed. Isn't that terrifying, these people coming up to him and talking to him about this? You know what's scary about what they say is that they noticed. They noticed what he was doing. They noticed where he'd been. They paid attention. And let me say this, if you call yourself a Christian, if you are a Christ follower, people are watching you at all times. People are watching. They're always paying attention to what you're doing. I was I had a guy one time, he wanted to work for me, and he wanted to be an intern first and then work into a director role, and he had a great resume, great guy, and but he just moved to the area, and I sat down to lunch with him one day. His name was RJ, and I'm sitting across from RJ, and we're at lunch, and I said, RJ, it's great to finally meet you and put a face with the name. I've heard your name before, never gotten to meet you. He goes, oh no, we've met. I said, I don't think so. He's like, no, Kevin, we've met. And I was like, I'm pretty good with faces. I'm sorry, but I'm blanking on this one. I don't remember that. He said, no, I'm the manager at the shoe store where you and your wife came in before Christmas to buy her boots. He said, I helped you pick out her boots. I said, man, you should have introduced yourself. That would have been awesome. He goes, no. I just wanted to watch. He said, I see you on stage every week. I just wanted to see how you really acted. That was the most terrifying conversation of my life. He said, I just wanted to see how you really were. I said, how was I? He's like, well, you bought some boots, so at least you're a good customer. You bought something, And, it's terrifying. People are always watching, especially when you've been with Jesus. And you know what I believe, and this sounds really cynical, I know, but you know what I believe in some ways? That the world is waiting for you to fail. As Christians, the world is waiting for you and I to fail. They're waiting for us just to mess everything up, to show it's just a big hoax, to show your life really can't be better than this, to show that there really is no redemption in this world, that everything is bad, everything is broken, everything is dark. They're waiting for you to fail. And they're watching for it. And Peter, in this scenario, he does it. He fails. And the next verse is the most gut-wrenching verse of the entire saga. It says this, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. You know the feeling you have when you've let somebody down, right? You know that feeling when you've hurt somebody. When you sit across a table from them and you look in their eyes and you can see the pain that you've caused. You know the feeling when you get that text message and your heart just drops. You're like, oh, I've hurt them. You know the feeling when that email comes in or you get that phone call that you're dreading and you know when you've hurt someone. Now imagine where Peter's at with this when the last words that Jesus would ever hear him speak before being crucified are that he doesn't even know him. He doesn't even know him. Those are the last words he's going to hear before he's crucified. And for all Peter knows, that's the end of the story. His best friend goes to death. And the last thing he said about him was, I don't even know who he is. He remembers then when the rooster crows and Jesus looks at him, that the Lord said, then remember, before the rooster crows today, you'll disown me 3 times. And it says he went outside and he wept bitterly. Bitterly. And now 3 years of friendship, 3 years of ministry, 3 years of seeing miracles happen, 3 years of seeing people come back to life, 3 years of seeing people walk that have been paralyzed. 3 years has now been undone by 3 denials. But guess what? It's now 3 days later. And 3 days later, we see that Jesus has been resurrected. And notice this, Peter has given up the dream of being a disciple. Peter's done with it. It says this, when the women come to find Jesus at the tomb, it says this in Mark 16, it says, do not be alarmed, he said. This is the angel speaking at the tomb. He says, do not be alarmed, he said, for you're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen, he is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter. Notice Peter gave up the dream. He's no longer a disciple. He's out on his own now. He goes back to what he knows. He says, hey, that whole thing of being a disciple, that was way out of my league. I was not ready for that. That whole thing was more than I was ready to handle. So I'm going to go back to what I know. I'm going to be a fisherman. And he goes back to fishing. And we see in John 21, Peter fishing. It says Simon, Peter, and Thomas, and Nathanael, and the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and 2 other disciples were together. And Peter says, I'm going out to fish. You know he's still just got to be wrecked from what happened 3 days before. He says, I'm just going to go out to fish. Simon told them, and they said, well, we'll go with you. So they went and they got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but his disciples did not realize it was Jesus. And Jesus calls out to them, friends, you got any fish? No, they answer. Then Jesus does something that Jesus has done before. He says, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. Man, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Peter's got to be hauling these fish in like, man, who is that dude on the shore? What is going on? And Peter's not the brightest fella, but he's trying to figure it out. What in the world? That sounds so familiar. He's hauling in all these fish. And then it says the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John, who wrote the book, he says to Peter, it's the Lord. And Peter's like, oh yeah, this has happened before. Thanks, disciple who Jesus loves. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wraps his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water, which seems really backwards. Seems like you would leave the outer garment off if you're going to jump in the water. Peter, again, not the brightest guy. I picture this scene like when Forrest Gump sees Lieutenant Dan. Remember that moment? And the boat just keeps going, and he just jumps in. Lieutenant Dan! And he's swimming towards him as fast as he can. That's what I see in my head. And he's not the brightest guy. And then it says that the other disciples followed in the boat, towing a net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And they were like, oh, Peter, you didn't have to do that, man. Like, they're probably getting there before he is, actually. Peter, do you want to ride? No, you good? Okay, we'll just let you swim. But he's got to be among these waves. He's swimming in, and he's seeing Jesus just above the waves over there on the shoreline. And he's got to be remembering that time when he was walking on the water, walking on the waves. As he sees these waves, he sees Jesus, and he remembers the time where he's sinking in the water, and Jesus walked up to him and pulled him up out of the water and told him, ye of little faith. And they had this walk back to the boat together. He's got to be remembering these things. And he gets to shore. It says this, when they were not far from shore, about 100 yards, they landed and they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. This is one of Jesus' weirdest miracles because he started a fire somehow and got fish and bread. We don't know how any of that happened. But he's sitting there on the shore waiting for them, waiting for breakfast. And they sit down together. Now, you've got to imagine this is going to be a very awkward conversation, right? And Jesus said to them, bring some of your fish you've just caught. So Simon, he climbs back in the boat and he drags the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come, have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. And then it says this, Jesus came, he took the bread and gave it to them. They're sitting around this fire. As they sit there, Peter's got to be smelling this smoke. He's got to be remembering what it was like sitting around these barrels where there was fire outside the high priest's house when he denied Jesus 3 times. He looks at Jesus as Jesus takes the bread and he breaks the bread and he gives it to him. And probably something in the way he does it, probably something with the way he breaks that bread reminds him of the Last Supper that they shared together. And he sees Jesus break this bread and he remembers the Last Supper and he sees the holes now in Jesus' hands as he hands him this bread. I'm imagining it's a pretty tense conversation from there. So Jesus looks at Peter after everybody's cleared off. He looks at him, he asks him a really simple question. It says, Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, well, then feed my lambs. But then Jesus presses a little bit further. Jesus said again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Jesus, and he waits. Simon says, you know that I do. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, well, then take care of my sheep. Then he says it a third time. And it says the third time that Simon actually gets a little bit cranky about it. The third time he says, Simon Peter, son of John, do you love me? And Peter looks at him and he gets distraught. He's actually a little bit upset about it. And maybe he's upset because maybe he's thinking, do you have to ask so many times? This is gut-wrenching for me, Jesus. Stop asking. This hurts. You know that I love you. Or maybe he's frustrated about it because he just realized that Jesus asked him 3 times if he loved him. Just like the 3 times he was asked if he knew Jesus and he denied him. And Peter answers one more time, you know that I love you. So Jesus says, feed my sheep. And then Jesus tells him this, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, you went where you wanted, but when you are old, you'll stretch out your hand and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And not just the death, but the lifestyle that Jesus is saying, hey, if you're all in on this, Peter, then you're all in, and I'm leaving you to start doing my work on this earth. And he kind of commissions him in this moment. And then Jesus ends with these 2 simple words, and he fully reinstates him, and he says these words. He says, then follow me. The first words that got Peter into this mess, the first conversation they had together when Peter first decided to become a disciple. See, Jesus has just fully forgiven Peter. He has just fully reinstated him. This horrible event has been fully reinstated. Their friendship is now back intact. And I will tell you this, while the world is waiting for you to fail, Jesus is waiting to forgive. Jesus is just waiting for the chance to forgive. He's sitting there with breakfast made. He's sitting there on the beach waiting for you. And you may go, I have done so many things. There's no way anyone could forgive me for this. No, that's not true. Because Jesus is just waiting to forgive. He's fully ready. And if you're in a spot today where you go, I have in some way or another, I have whatever that looks like denied Christ. My relationship is not where it should be. I know that I've messed up. Let me tell you, it's not too far gone. It's not something that Jesus is worried about. He will forgive right now, today, in this very place. And if you're in a place where you feel like that's you, that needs to happen, I'm gonna invite you to come up in just a second. The band's gonna come up, they're gonna sing a song, and these altars are open as they are every single Sunday. And you're welcome to come up, you're welcome to bring somebody to pray with you, you're welcome to pray by yourself. Whatever it is that you wanna do, come on up and pray. And you're welcome to come up here and ask for forgiveness because Jesus will give it to you. Jesus will forgive. It's not too far gone. While the world waits for you to fail, Jesus is waiting to forgive. I'll be down here to pray with you if you come on up. And I'm going to pray for us right now as we enter into this time. God, I thank you so much for the example of your son. I thank you so much for the way that he loves regardless of how we love in return. God, I thank you so much that the flaws that we have are not something you're worried about. The things that we're bad at are not something that you're concerned about, God. The times that we've denied you, God, that you would still forgive us and reinstate us no matter what that looks like. And today, God, when you say follow me to us, God, I pray that we would accept that invitation wholeheartedly, that we would follow you, that we would follow you into forgiveness. So God, I pray that during this time, we would be open and honest with you. We'd have conversations with you that we need to have. Pray that we'd be willing to come to the beach, to sit down with you, to see our past failures and see you forgive them. Pray this in your name. Amen.